Hi, I'm gonna walk you through how to integrate Gemini with mcp.run on Android. So before we start, you're gonna need a JDK installed on your system, and I suggest using SDK man to set up and configure all of the JDKs on your machine. You're gonna need Android Studio. Android Studio is the integrated development environment for Android. We suggest using this environment for ease of development. Finally, you're going to need a GitHub account for authenticating to mcp.run. You also need a Google account with API access so that you can get a Google API key for Gemini. You will need a Google API key for Google Maps as well. And we also need a Brave Search API key on the free API tier to do searches with Brave. This is if you plan to use the servlets for Google Maps and Brave Search. I'm going to show you now how to log in into mcp.run, get your session ID, and install those servlets. We're going to copy and paste this command in the terminal. Now, a browser window will open and we'll be requested to give our confirmation. So I'm going to click Allow Login, and I'm going to now be logged in into the system. Now I can install all of the servlets that I'll need for this demo. So I'm going to need Fetch, and I'm going to click Install. I don't need to change any of this, just click Save. I'm going to need the Google Maps integration. I can install it from here. I'm going to paste here my API key, and I'm going to save it. And then finally, I'm going to go to Brave, and do the same here. Just paste your API key here, leave the config as it is, and save. If everything went well, you should be able to see Fetch, Brave Search, and Google Maps. All right, now I'm going to create a new project here. I'm going to pick a Gemini API starter. I'm going to use the config options that are suggested in the tutorial. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to use this package name. I'm going to use this name for the application. And I'm going to use this API level 33 and Kotlin for the build config language. In this window, I'm going to need to paste the API key or generate the API key for Gemini. Once you're done, you just click Finish, and the project will be generated for you. So in order to make sure that everything works correctly, we're going to need to make a few changes to the config. We're going to want to add Maven with the Jetpack repo, which we're going to use to install the ncp4j library later. And we can also include Maven local if we want to use snapshot versions. You're going to also want to navigate to local.properties. If you cannot see it, you just change the visualization for the navigation bar. And you're going to want to set a new property mcp.run key and paste the session ID you obtained earlier in the terminal. Paste it here. Here you're going to see already your API key for Gemini that you pasted in the wizard. Before you start, you might also need to do a few other changes. You may need to review your compile SDKs here and your target SDK and main SDK. Make sure that they all match this way, and then you should be good to go. We also want to make sure that we're using a recent version of the generative AI SDK. So navigate to Gradle libs version TOML and make sure that the version is 090. If everything went well, now you can run your application, click the button, and you will get a result based on the images and the textual prompt. We will now need to add a few more dependencies and check the versions for all the dependencies that we're pasting. So we're going to need ncpx4j, Jackson data bind, and we're going to make sure that the version of generative AI is the right one. Right, let's make sure that the version for generative AI is 090. Then we're going to need to add the version for ncpx4j and for Jackson. And then we're going to define mcx4j here and Jackson data bind. Finally, we need to refer to these libraries in app build Gradle KTS. So we're going to paste implementation libs mcpx4j, implementation libs Jackson data bind, and make sure that in your settings you have made available jetpack.io, and if you want to use mass snapshot version, make it local. All right, now we're gonna finally write the code. So before we start, we're gonna create an object that will contain the functions for our applications. This will contain the function from mcp.run and expose them in a way that is usable from the Kotlin app. What the function repository does is expose into fields function declarations, which are the native way through which the Gemini SDK expects function to be described, and then mcpx tools, which is the way we will store our tools fetched from the mcp.run servers and instantiated into executable code through the Chicory Java WebAssembly runtime. So we just exposed one method call that takes the name of the tool and takes the arguments as a map, and we're going to pass them, translate them to the right representation that our tool actually expect, convert them to a string, which is the serialization format. It's a JSON string that we're going to use, pass them into the tool, and then we're going to also add a few lines of logging so that we can read in the console what's happening under the hood. And then finally, we're always returning a valid result. The next thing we need to do is actually connecting to the service and fetching the servlets. And this is where you're really using the ncp4j library. Let's take a look at that. So here we're writing a tool fetcher object that's just exposing one method. All this method does is instantiating mcpx for J with a few parameters. The first one is obviously the ncp.run key that we have set in the local.properties file, and then we're going to create we're going to pass a few options. In Android, as compared to the other Java platforms, if you've already seen those tutorials, we're going to need to use a different HTTP client. So let's make sure you use that one, HTTP Your Connection Client Adapter. This is a very simple HTTP client that uses a built-in of the JDK library that is both available on Android and also on the regular JDK. It's not the most performant possibly, but you can also pass your own implementation, and it works for this demo. You will also need to define a logger because the built-in logger that's provided in the Chicory SDK is specific to the JDK, but don't worry, it's not a lot of code, it's just a couple of lines. Then we're gonna also instantiate the HTTP client for the ncpx client library, which happens to be the same. We're still on Android. Then what we're going to do is call this refresh installation with the default profile ID, and then we're going to fetch and instantiate all of the servlets. Finally, we're going to create, navigate this result, which happens to be a collection of servlets, and we're going to create two maps. The first map is a map from string to function declaration, which is necessary and used by the Gemini API. And then the other is just a map that goes from string to ncpx tools that we're going to use to invoke the right functions at the right time. Notice that in the first step here, we're invoking this toFunction declaration that's been defined here. This creates the function declaration using the SDK and the define function API. But it's also parsing the schema that we return as a string from the ncpx tool object. Now, the details of how this works are not really interesting, so I'm not going to go through those, but it's essentially translated from the string to the internal representation that the SDK expects. And you can find all of this code online. So now we need to expose the tools to the Gemini API and the Gemini SDK. So how we're going to do that? Well, we're going to create another object called the chat session. The chat session, all the chat session is going to do is instantiate the generative model. We're going to use Gemini 2.0, which has been just released. We're going to use, obviously, our API key that we configured in the local properties and in the wizard. And we're going to then plug our tools. So this is our function repository that we created earlier. And we're going to pass all of the function declarations into the tools field. We're going to provide a system prompt that's going to be useful, that's going to tell the assistant to be, helpful. And you're going to find this in the tutorial as well, obviously. Then we're going to start the chat. And then finally, we're providing a generate content method that we're going to call from the UI. So it's a suspendable function, because it's going to do I/O, so we don't want to block while we're doing stuff in the UI. But don't worry, since you were using Kotlin and it comes with coroutine supports and everything is well integrated with Android, you won't even notice that something is happening under the hood. Some blocking calls are happening. So what we're going to do here is sending a message, the first message with our first content to the Gemini service, and then we're going to get a response. Now the response contains 0 or more function calls depending on the prompt that you're going to provide. So what we're going to do is iterate on the function calls that we find in a response, replace them, essentially interpret them one by one by invoking the function in our function repository. And then for each function that was requested to be evaluated, we're going to return a function response part with the name of that function and the result of invoking that function. Then finally, we're going to reassign the response variable and send the result of invoking all those functions back to our service. And we're going to use this API so that all the parts are sent separately in the right format. Finally, when we exit and leave this loop, it means that we no longer have function calls to consume, and then we can just return the response here. So now let's navigate back to our baking view model. This is how the baking view model should look like, more or less. Maybe you'd have a different model here, but you should make sure you're using Gemini 2.0 FlashExp for this demo. But we're going to replace this code with some other code. We're actually going to wire the code that we just wrote. Luckily, it's not a lot of changes. We just need to replace the field, and instead of instantiating a generative model, we're going to instantiate a chat session. Since the chat session does some I/O, because if you recall, we're instantiating the generative model, and we're starting a chat, but we're also creating the function repository. In fact, we're invoking the tool fetcher here, the fetch functions here, which will create the repository for you. So we want this to happen in an on an I/O thread. So we create a variable that's a late init variable. We're going to create an init block here with the initial state of loading, so that we get a nice spinner when we start the application to show that something's going on. And while this is running, we're gonna instantiate, do the fetching, create a repo, wire everything together, assign the chat session, and then finally get back to the initial state. You don't need to change anything else in the code for now. We can already try our applications now. So let's start it. It will be loaded. And now, as you can see, we have a spinner running. It means that it's fetching our applets, our servlets. It will take a little while, but once the spinner stops running, we can actually paste our prompt. So let's head back to our to our tutorial, and we can paste this prompt here. All right, let's click the Go button, and then I have opened the log cut here, and I put the invoking filter here so that I can read what's happening under the hood. And as you can see, it's already starting fetching the list from the URL that I provided, and then it's getting maps directions between the places that are listed in that file. And finally, it's using Brave Web Search to find a tourist guide for Paris. Just so you know, in case you didn't notice, this actually contains as places to visit Tour Eiffel, Louvre, and Montmartre. So once it has finished processing, you can see that there's a summary of the directions with instruction to go from one place to the other, and then there's a travel guide summary for you to use. That's pretty nice. All right, but we still have pictures of baking goods here, so I wonder, what if we instead use pictures of the Tour Eiffel and let it figure out where we want to go? Let's try that. So we don't really need a lot of changes at this point because Gemini is already a multi-model model. So essentially, we just need to change the pictures that we have there already provided by the original tutorial and change them with picture from Paris. So let's try that. So I took some pictures from Wikipedia so that I know that they're licensed. So for instance, there's a picture of the Tour Eiffel, there's a picture of the Mona Lisa, right? There we go. Right. And there's a picture of Montmartre. There we go. I'm going to use the small version of these so that they don't take a lot of memory. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to my project and paste them there. So under the drawable, I pasted them as Mona_Lisa, Montmartre, Tour Eiffel, and I made sure to refer them. I have to use this specific encoding because there's a convention in Android, so it's important that we follow it. So we're going to head back to the baking screen .kt, which we haven't touched so far. We're going to replace the heading with these images, right? And that's pretty much all we need to do. We also need to change the strings here. So let's navigate to strings.xml. I'm going to change the first description to the Tour Eiffel, the second to the Mona Lisa, and the third to the Montmartre. And then I'm going to also change the baking title, the title of our app, the name of our app. And finally, I'm also changing the prompt placeholder because now I can give it a full, since we're here. And the prompt, it's going to take into account those pictures. I would like to visit the place in the first picture and then see the painting in the second picture. Can you give directions between them and find a guide online? Start from the first, then go to the second, and then give me a summary of the directions and of the guide. So I'm going to restart my application now. It's going to rebuild. And as you can see now, instead of the baking goods, there's the Tour Eiffel and the Mona Lisa. So now it's loading again my servlets, and as you can see, the default prompt has changed. So now let's click the Go button and wait a little bit. As you can see, something is going on again in the log window. So it's definitely figured out that we want to go visit the Tour Eiffel and the Louvre Museum. And as you can see, here's the directions that I figured out just from the pictures. And finally, here's also a summary of the tour that we could take. So that's pretty nice. I think that's pretty impressive. All right, that was it. If you need any support, you can visit our support page. Thanks for watching, and hope you'll enjoy working with mcp.run.